and welcome to Well That Aged Well live stream. I'm listening. And this week, or this month, should I rather say, we are joined by Danny Witchfinder Burke, and who is naturally a witch historian. And because the topic is kind of perfect, really, because it's Halloween, and witches are, of course, associated with Halloween. And let's begin with how cool is it to study witches for a living? Because if I may, I'm just gonna try. If I'm on my phone a little bit, I'm going to try to share that we are live right now. So while I'm sharing that we are live on the various social medias we have, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you ended up? And it's if you saw, I should probably interfere a little bit because we did an episode last Halloween special. This year's Halloween special is about Dante's Inferno, which you should absolutely check out. But he was on last year's Halloween special, but we've it's gonna, if you've seen it already, it's probably gonna be a little bit repeat from there, but we hopefully some new stuff as well. But if before we begin the real conversation, how did you end up studying witches? And while I share that we are finally alive, how did this happen?
Well, there was a point where I was a very sensible political historian. I was an undergrad. Um, I
What
was
we
thinking
are
about. I was an undergrad at Oxford at Lincoln College. I had the wonderful Susan Brigton, absolutely adorable person. Her love for Sir Thomas Wyatt knows no bounds. And I had Perry Gorsey, who wrote a fascinating book about Great Yarmouth art of the 1660s. And I've been tempted by the Eastern Association, which is the um, Civil War organisation that was meant to run East Anglia, treated as a concrete unit to collect taxes, gather an army. It's the place where Oliver Cromwell rose to prominence, and then besieged the beginnings of the New Model Army. And that was all very sensible and political and financial. And he says, "That's really interesting, Danny. But I study Great Yarmouth, and there's something weird going on there in the 1640s, 1650s. It's politics. It's a bit divided. There's a lot of religious nonconformity. How do people kind of get on with each other?" Now, this then shifted when I went to the University of East Anglia for an MA, and I met the incredible Malcolm Gaskell, who obviously wrote the book on the Witchfinders. And he did some fantastic work on Matthew Hopkins. He goes, Danny, that very sensible political crisis you're looking at, it does happen at exactly the same time as a witch hunt. Are these two related? And basically, I didn't look back from there. The witch hunt, as a product of this religious and political division, became the thing that everyone wants to know, or at least this time of year, that the two are interlinked. What we think of as this discrete political religious crisis is something that's deeply, deeply clothed in the language of the cataclysm, of the role of the devil. And the witch hunt is only decipherable, understandable as part of this crisis. We have people for whom their political careers, their passion for religious reformation can be understood as part of this battle of the devil. And for them, the witch is extremely decipherable through that. So yes, that's how I've ended up talking about witches ever since.
Mm. And we spoke a little bit about this on a stream last year. I can't believe it's been 1 year already. It's kind of crazy to think about, and it's been a friendship that kind of been in the making ever since. But it's kind of a little bit niche area, isn't it, to study witches? But what is our people's reaction when you say, "Oh, I study witch history for a living"?
Well, there's several different reactions because obviously witchcraft has permeated our world so much now. We think about it in terms of um, the popular perception of the witch. Oh, just look at how the cruel patriarchy harmed little old ladies who were speaking too much, and that's kind of a germ of truth to that, but it's a bit more complicated. Or it's something that's either about paganism, which I think isn't true for the 17th century, 16th century, and their perceptions of what the witch was, or they are concerned with it's concerned with their panic about how people interacted So yeah, the tendency is to think about it's either just Halloween or it's
I-
superstition or it's fear or it's
is the Salem witch trials the
it
first thing that come to mind to people?
could be Salem, it might be Sabrina the Teenage Witch, it might be Harry Potter, it might be the Witchfinder General. All these kind of popular perceptions, but they tend to very much simplify a very complex story.
Hmm. So let's, and again, we will be following a little bit structure from the last time we recorded. Let's begin with the ancient time, because witches has always kind of existed in popular culture, from the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, and until medieval era. But it seems that, and I believe Ronald Hutton argued this as well, who's one of the most famous historians on this subject. But he argues that it's not really until the 15th, 16th century that witchcraft become kind of thing and evil associated with evil and
Mm.
hell and Satan. But let's talk a little bit about how this happened and why there were how antiquity dealt with witches and how antiquity, because of course one of the most famous and ancient witches, and this is an episode in itself, I'm sure. It's uh, it's associated with Circe from the Odyssey. So let's talk a little bit about how the history of ancient witches before we go into your field.
Yeah, well, I think the ancient magic users are fascinating. So we have a variety of them that have different roles. So we can think of someone like Circe or Medea. These are people who have vast amounts of power, upend some of the social order because they are a dominant woman, but their power is merely, it could be a good power, it could be a bad power. It's up to how the user makes use of it. We see some really positive images, so, or at least neutral, of people like the Delphic Oracle. So a woman who sits by
Mm,
a sacred stream of atmosphere coming from the ground. They're using that to prophesy the future, and the prophecies they're giving are accurate, if cryptic. We've got people like the Vestal Virgins, whose duty is to defend the sacred fire of Rome, to predict it, to predict things. These are relatively positive figures for those societies. Um, magic could be used to harm, it could be used to punish, but it's common throughout. It's also priestly. You have the images from the Bible where it mentions pharaohs, magicians who can turn staffs into snakes and being defeated by the power of the true
mm.
God. But in some ways, Moses isn't that different from them.
Yeah, I was going
These
to mention
powers
as well.
all kind of exist, but something changes in the 15th century. So there's several different trends going on at once. Firstly, we have that sort of differentiation between academic magic, which, your Dr. Faustus moves from one way to the other. He starts off as he's interested in the esoteric, but starts making a deal with the devil, and that's the change. When do you use your magic power not as something you've learnt, not as something to heal, which again, very important for the Catholic Church, which is deeply magical, but it's again seen as a positive magic of healing,
Mm.
of restoring, of giving a grip on the world,
If I may
healing.
interfere, Jesus was kind of magical himself, wasn't he? Because
Yeah,
he broke the bread and he feed other people. He walked on water, and he makes a blind guy see him comes back from the dead. So he was kind of magical himself,
look
wasn't
at
he?
the early modern. Well, to the medieval mind, there's a difference between divine miracles. So he's using the power of God through him, and magic of a commoner sort. But again, you can see that in sort of the saints and the way they do miracles. It's a fine line about definitions rather than it a specific difference, as you say. Um, but in the early modern, yes, from that split at the end of the early modern age, with the arrival of the Malus Maleficiarum, created by a couple of inquisitors, it's the idea that the magic you're getting now is via demonic pact. It is not a healing or helpful magic, it's a magic used to harm that derives its power from doing a deal with the devil. You're sacrificing part of your soul to do it. And that means you're no longer a neutral figure or someone drawing upon the powers existing in the world. And that's not to say that the figure of the cunning folk, as who Tabitha Stanmore has recently talked about, disappear, but there's becoming a discrete class of evil magic user, which at times runs the risk of defining all magic users, that they are people who draw power from the devil, from some kind of demonic pact, that means they are using that power to harm. Even if it looks like they're doing it to help, they're doing it to further the devil's cause.
Mm. So why is magic associated with devil's work? And again, I don't read the from the last time you were on, but it's always seemed like, even like you said, even though they're helping people, they are associated with the devil. So where does the idea of devil worship come from, and why is magic always associated as the dark arts?
Well, this has been the debate about the historiography of witchcraft. So one of the things when we go back to that, we get the likes of Keith Thomas. So religion and the kind of magic. There's partly about a religious conception of the world. It's going to be a bit more regularized. The magical elements in the world are no longer part of the miraculous creation. We're getting the idea of the clockwork god. Turns the knob, the whole thing functions. His direct intervention in the world is seen as more limited, which means if there's a direct supernatural involvement in the world, there's a tendency now to see that as demonic influence or harmful influence. That's not to say that, again, there's still a role for divine providence, that God's protecting people, God offers protection. But particularly post the Reformation and post the Counter Reformation, the magical role for gods, for ministers, is becoming very much more limited.
Hmm. So that it, like I said, it didn't really seem to be a problem until the 15th or 16th century with witchcraft. So how did the early or quote dark ages view witchcraft before the 15th or 14th century? Before we go into again, before we go into the real time when witches become a real problem for people.
There's definitely fears of bewitchment quite early. We always have figures who are seen to be more powerful than they should be, particularly women. Um, Joan of Navarre um, is particularly notable for it. I think so. The allegations against the Cathars and their beliefs there start to tend into these beliefs that they're secretly demonic worship. So it's not that they're worshipping God; they've moved on for another level of heresy where they start worshipping the devil. Um, Anne Boleyn is another figure who's again allegedly bewitching
Mm.
because she's suddenly got that much power over
Mm.
King Henry VIII
Yeah.
that the explanation is dark magical power. So it's not like it's a trope that exists even before it becomes widespread in quite the same way it is with the 16th and 17th centuries.
Mm. And if I may interrupt it again, because of course, it's mostly associated with women, where seduction perhaps part of, oh, she must wield dark magic because you know it's seduction kind of where was that kind of associated with this magic and
Well, partly
dark
again, if
powers.
we just think about the patriarchal concept of society, if you are a woman, what avenues are there for you to gain power over men, to gain revenge on them? So it's poison, it's witchcraft, it's cunning. If you're a man, you can just go punch someone basically, or you have a duel, or you have a legal case. If you're a man, how do you think a woman can get revenge on you? There's not many options left to them but to seek some way that's secretive, undermining. And magic is the best example of it, but it's not the only one.
Mm. And if even if you were clever, you because God forbid in those days if you were a clever woman, like for example, to bring one example, the Eleanor of Aquitaine, you were with kind of witch hunt because she would were accused of sleeping with all these people because she was hot and she was the seductress, and she was clever and she lived for quite a long time. So if you were not were smart, there had to be some dark powers because women in those days, they the mindset of the Middle Ages, you can have a smart woman. Some people viewed it. Did some people view it that way? Because if you had a clever woman, there's had to be some powers behind this.
Oh, the perils of live streaming. So I I think we can exaggerate that. So again, we know that there are different forms of wise women, of clever women available to society, and they played a significant role. They're not generally accused of witchcraft at most periods, because again, you need someone who can find your lost things or provide medicine. We tend to sometimes accuse this. So we think of the likes of midwives who had a vital role in early modern survival, standing on the cusp of life and death for both woman, mother, and their child, um, privy to some of their darkest secrets. They were expected to, discover if the woman had been loyal, if the child belonged to the supposed father. These are not people you can lose in a society. They are so important. So I think we need to be slightly careful of just suggesting that knowledge itself, or female knowledge, is seen as particularly dangerous. In fact, it seems to be more about neighborliness. How does someone fit into society? How do they communicate, and the kind of expectations there? So again, which woman do you think is going to be the hardest to fit into an early modern society? Is it going to be someone clever, or is it going to be someone poor, someone angry, someone embittered, someone without support?
Mm.
So again, it's
And
more about these people who are on the margins, but do not have a role, do not have a position. And in fact, there's the danger of charity, because again, charity requires someone to be able to support you, but also requires you to act in the expected way to them. You have to be able to offer them um, the right level of supplication, the right level of thanks. And if you don't, well, you're breaking the rules of neighborliness. You're not being the right kind of supportive person that they want, and that can get you in an awful large amount of trouble.
mm. And again, as to use Cersei as an example, medicine were as well kind of associated with, and herbs were associated with witchcraft. So people are genuinely, women and genuinely knew a bit of medicine, and knew what herbs to use to heal someone. And like you said, even when they tried to help someone, they would be accused of witchcraft because that they use kind of powers beyond our control and dark magic to heal that person they try to save. So medicine, even when they were trying to be helpful, they would be accused for as a witch, or
That
So
tends to
let's
be a
talk a
bit
little bit about how
rarer.
medicine played a role here.
That tends to be rarer. So we've got the issue is that these women, again, educated, highly part of society, because again, they
Hmm.
play an important role. The issue could be, again, if you fail, again, you're on a bit of a knife edge. And again, so the magical healing is almost a response to the decline of magic in the church. Um, Again, examples in Alsace-Lorraine of women using church wax, bread to try and remove the sin, remove the poison. The wax needs to be mixed into it to give it a kind of purity. This is definitely a Christian world. They aren't appealing to the mother goddess or anything like that. They are appealing to Jesus and magical healing in that way. And again, most of them, unless they cross a particular line, like providing poisons, like failing to heal, or being used in legal pursuit, you generally get away with it.
Hmm. So, what made someone think that, oh, she got to be a witch, and how did this go about? How did someone find out? Like, and again, I want to bring up the
Mm.
famous Monty Python scene in the Holy Grail where they accuse someone of being a witch who obviously wasn't, and so, oh, she gave me a newt. Was it that simple? Could someone say she gave me a newt and she is a witch? And how easy was it to accuse someone of being a witch?
Pretty difficult. First of all, we've got to think about why would you accuse someone of being a witch? It's not just on a whim. In most of the Anglo-Saxon world, you do not see people getting goods or any advantage from this. The only advantage you get is you break the bewitchment. And that means that, again, you're in a position where you feel someone has got a power over you. So this could be all kinds of things, the classic example of things like crops dying, of milk turning sour, cows dying. But in cases I've seen, children languishing in bed for 18 months, almost becoming lifeless, sort of living death. Um, the case of Agnes Lakeland in Ipswich, Mother Lakeland, absolutely tragic. This poor man who was going to marry Agnes's daughter, he breaks off the engagement. His ship sinks. He gets a tumor on his leg, which bends him over so he can't stand up straight. It's weird. It's shaped in the size of a dog. This is not a natural illness. Other sets of bewitchment accused allegedly vomiting up pins. Like, what the heck's happened there? With King James VI, he is caught in an unusual storm trying to get to his wife, Anne of Denmark, in the 1590s. It's a storm that lasts for weeks. That's the kind of thing that would, the risk of death, either the damage from the storm, but also the lack of stores. It's not just anything. Again, it fits. Why is the 16th and 17th century a point where people are so worried about this? What's going on there? Most people think about things like the Little Ice Age. I mean, how bad is Little Ice Age? It feels like the world's ending at times. So as the temperature drops, we get really unusual events.
I'm
We
gonna
talk,
ask, what,
yeah.
if I may, was the Black Death partly cause of why people started believing in witchcraft? Because it was kind of right before, right? But was this, as you're nodding your head there? So was it not big part of why people
It's
started
certainly,
believing in
well,
witchcraft?
with a chain of causality. So the changes going on the church that followed the Black Death, certainly influence of the Reformation and ideas that are inspiring witchcraft. So ideas about covenant. Think about people like Huss, Jan Hus in Bohemia, and then Luther in Germany. The way they think about the relationship with God, the idea of the covenant there, then mirrors the kind of covenant that people fear witches have with the devil. He's an inversion. The devil um, is an inversion of God, the witch an inversion of the good Christian. So without those ideas of really strong relationship between the Christian and God, can you have that idea of the devil and the witch? Certainly the population changes there. And so the persecutions, I mean, the horrendous persecution of Jews during the Black Death and afterwards, you can see in those some of the foretastes of the kind of violence meted out, sort of an idea of an enemy within, someone who proves to be acceptable, being so severely punished. Certainly, but I think it's hard to draw a direct causation there in quite the same way. But you can add the sense of apocalyptic feel. Europe in the 16th and particularly the 17th century feels like the world is ending. Crops are failing more regularly. The world is getting colder and harsher. Nations are being forced into religious conflicts, confessional conflicts, where they're worried about an enemy within. It's not much of a step to go, well, there's a Huguenot who'll betray us and will have us murdered, to saying there's a witch. There's a secret Catholic community in England that we kind of know about. That's not that much different. The recusant Catholic, the Quaker, the family of love, all these secret communities of people worshipping God in their own way, but choosing to be separate from the rest of the community. The witch is kind of the same thing, but just instead of to a different version of God, it's to the devil. So
I
all
want
these
to
planes, yeah.
Before we move on, I just want to say for those of you who are listening to this podcast tonight, if you have any questions about witches, you can ask them in the live chat, and we will try to read your comments when we have time. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the live chat, and we'll try to answer them for you, or he will try to answer them for you. And yeah, so feel free to write as much as you want, and we'll try to see what we can do about it. I want to talk a little bit about the Bible and how the Bible deal with witchcraft, and because Bible
Mm.
in medieval times were of course a big part of the witch hunt, I believe. So let's talk about a little bit about how the Bible deals with witchcraft in its scripture.
Yes. Well, again, there's a couple of different named sorcerers we've talked about with Moses. We've talked about that,
Mm.
but there is also the commendation. You should not allow sorcerers to live. That's translated, obviously, in the King James Bible as "Thou shalt not suffer the witch to live." Sarah, who dropped by, obviously her podcast, currently called Witch Hunt. It's absolutely brilliant. I recommend it because they go into all the details of Salem, etc., and so many interesting people. Good, you've got your plug, Sarah. Don't worry. Um, but that translation again from the early modern period, "Thou shalt not suffer the witch to live." The danger of a magic use against it is then seen from that. We also see various sermons from the time taking this theme up about that idea of spiritual corruption that has in it a biblical precedent for the use of illegal magic users within community that are seen as persuasively evil forces undermining the kingdom of Israel, which of course you see your own world is a parallel to that biblical world.
Were there anti-Semitism? Or of course, that was no term yet by the time. It's a more modern 19th century term or
Mm.
20th. I don't remember exactly when that term became. I think it's late 19th century. But was there a bit of anti-Semitism when it came to witch hunts? That Jews were targeted
Yeah, I
especially.
well, again, it's often about the line of the stranger. Sadly, we see in things like the German witch hunts. You might start with Protestants if you're Catholic, then you might move on to the Jews, then you might move on to the witches. There's definitely that sense of, again, enemy within, and the line between Jewish people who have obviously a different private faith, who do not acknowledge Jesus the Messiah. And again, some of the magical practices used by Jewish people, again, particularly concerned with the idea of the evil eye and protection from possible magical.
If I may
Yeah.
interfere, where we have a comment by Mary Ann who says perhaps some links with the demonology that King James has published.
Yes, the demonology is really important. Again, it's not the first demonology nor the last, but it represents
Uh,
that very educated interest in witchcraft. That it's not just something that's about beliefs held by ordinary people in villages, but it's codified. That's so important because, again, it means it's definable. It's definable as something that can be punished. So if we think about the Witchcraft Acts in England, 1563, 1604, those codify witchcraft. So the diabolical maleficia, the evil magic, which is called in English witchcraft, which is then punishable by death. And it's punishable by death by the crown courts, not by the church courts, which again quite unusual. Again, unusual that England, Wales, and then New England we hang rather than burn them as a heretic. It's a case of treason against God. So by someone like James codifying these beliefs, he also gave them a legitimacy. I mean, a lot of it in England um, is still technically illegal throughout most of the period. So the swimming of witches, so throwing a rope across a river or a body of water that allows them to be see if they float or rise. If they float, which again, according to James, is a rejection of their baptism, so therefore they've joined the devil's party. If they sink, holding on to they're not going to drown, but it's proof that therefore the water accepts them. They are not secretly of the devil's party. Some of these things are pretty close to torture. And King James justifies them, and we can see in the more decentralised legal system of Scotland is much easier to pursue witches. But the demonology, it's quite limited in its influence in England until the civil wars, when the government becomes so much more diffuse. But um, it still has a lot of influence, particularly with the witchfinder Matthew Hopkins, again, another educated man. So again, always important to remember, this isn't being carried out by illiterate yokels on a whim forming a mob. This is through a legal judicial process that says this is
it's
legitimate. This,
if I may interrupt you,
yeah,
it's always interesting to see when you see these tyrants and see these people, and again it comes to the witch hunt, it comes to the Third Reich, it comes to the Stalin is always seemed these intelligent people behind, and even Trump today, it's always seemed to be the intelligent people behind the man who's not so clever himself, and it's quite fascinating how these intelligent people rally to this tyranny, and even in like you said with the witchfinder, and how these people seem to rally to these awful things when they have so high IQ, and how intelligent they are. It's kind of a little bit depressing, really.
Well, I think that, to be honest, there's always, because there's a nugget of truth in there, that there is someone out to get there. Think of the 1950s witch hunt. There were Soviet agents in the United States of America, but you're panicking about the wrong ones. It's not the people who are writing plays about with a social conscience that are the real enemy. It's the people leaking the nuclear secrets. It's not someone in Senate who's read a pamphlet about Marx,
Mm.
but there are real reasons for people to be paranoid and concerned, because again they have such high standards for themselves. They're worried about religious nonconformity. They're worried about what happened. Are these
Is it the idea of losing power that worries them?
Yes. Well, it's not even just losing power, it's losing cohesion. And again, it's something we can see today with someone like Trump, that there's a lot of the sports there, that the modern world brings so many more ideas with the printing
Mm.
press, with the access to knowledge. People take knowledge, and they've got the Bible, they'll read it in any way they like. But this means that, again, you get such radical ideas coming out of it, that it means that it's harder to just bring people together and say, we're all going to worship together. We're all going to believe the same things. We're going to have a safe community. Once Luther and Huss, to some extent, have broken that sense of unity, you can never quite put it back together again. There's always this fear of, a heretic, of a secret conventicle, a secret meeting, and the witch is like that's made manifest and exaggerated. You know, the witch is almost like a terrorist. Someone who has the power to harm, has the power to destroy, as an exaggerated version of the fear of the unknown, of the different, of the stranger. And it's worse because they could be anyone. Some nice little old lady who lives in your community for years has secretly been the devil's party, was secretly planning your
Mm.
death.
So what caused them to turn around, like you said, on these nice old ladies that haven't done anyone harm? What caused them to, like, oh, she's definitely a witch? What
To be fair, it's not
and
necessarily a
again,
nice
how
little old
easy?
lady.
You said it wasn't earlier. You said it wasn't easy to accuse someone of being a witch. So
Well,
what went into how could you lay out the pitch that, oh, my neighbor, she's an old hag, she's a witch? How the easy or difficult, should I rather say, was this accusation?
so it's going to take you a bit of time. First of all, again, the first thing is you need to have a reason to suspect them. So something bad has happened to you, but also you have a reason to suspect them in particular. So again, Keith Thomas argues what's called the charity refuse model, and I've seen cases of it in the wild. There's definitely a sense that people ask for charity, they don't receive it, they leave cursing, and then suddenly they're suspected as the person behind it all. They're using, because of that anger, they've been turned to the devil's party, or they're using a devil's power against them, against their neighbours. But again, this needs to be going on for quite some time. There are also, first of all, other remedies you can use to try and break the devil's power. So in East Anglia, where I'm from, they love picking up Northern German or Dutch bottles called Bellarmine jugs. You may have seen them. They've got the figure of a medieval
Was it?
card.
And again, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but was it easier to accuse foreigners of this than, say,
Not
locals?
really, because there's no reason to suspect foreigners particularly. And again, England's population tends to be a bit more mobile than we think. Between a third to two-thirds of people might move in their lifetime. I mean, maybe only to a neighbouring parish, but that's quite a lot of people moving in and out. But again, it's marginal people. So these people that are receiving charity, people who haven't tend to get voices to support them. So they may lack male relatives, um, maybe widows or spinsters. So these are the people who are kind of suspicious. But again, there's a certain logic to it. First of all, in terms of their thinking, the people who do not have a male voice to speak to them lack power. Therefore, they will have to turn instead to a different means to get revenge. So you can't just hit someone, like we said. You can't poison someone. You have to ask the devil to do it for you.
Mm.
So that's our first element. The second element of that is the issue of what's going on to a woman post menopause. Partly, again, it can lead to people suffering from things like dementia, sadly. It can also, strip
Schizophrenia.
away some of the expectations of politeness. I think we've all known older women who are blunt, they just don't have time for nonsense. So, again, there's a sense there that
Could
can
someone
leave
just like
them.
spoke their mind be accused
Exactly.
of being
So that
rich?
means that the kind of niceties, the expectations of neighbourliness that is so important to early modern society are being ripped away. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to accuse them of witchcraft. You need to have that ill fortune to go with it. You need to have a sense of concern there. But also, you'll try and break the magic a different way, first of all.
Mm.
So I mentioned the witch's bottles, just said the Bellarmine jug, you put in urine, you put in metal, you put that in the fire. Try and break it that way. You might just break the thatch from the window. In some of the most desperate circumstances, we have people mutilating the face. That's one way to break a
Oof.
bewitchment. You have to cut.
Oof.
Again, it's sad. It's absolutely awful, sexist, misogynist
It gives you
behaviour.
nightmares. It can, really can.
I mean, I think the best, well, the worst case of this is Mark Stoll talks about it very convincingly in his essay on the Battle of on Farndon Field. So this is where the Parliamentarian army catches up with the Royalist baggage train after the Battle of Naseby. You've got thousands of camp followers, women who've been providing food, um, supporting the Royalist army. They're captured and they're mutilated and murdered. And this mutilation, partly it might be the fact that about these might be Welsh, Irish women, so are seen as kind of lesser women to the very, chauvinistically English New Model Army. But partly again, this is the sense that the Royalist cause is bewitched. These women have power, and again, we've people know quite well the story of Rupert, Prince Rupert the Rhine, and his poodle boy, who's a lesbian familiar, in a Royalist satirical poem. But these all emerge in the spectrum. But so these are your possible recourses before you even get to trial. And to be honest, most of the time you don't want to get to trial because trials don't normally work. The example I think McFarlane has worked out, Alan McFarlane, in terms of Essex, 1 in 10 accusations succeeded. This isn't just you point at someone, they're automatically a witch. So this means that you've taken someone to trial, which is expensive. You've been shamed publicly because you've accused someone of a witch and it's failed, so you look ridiculous. And then on top of that, you've now got someone who you think has magical power over you to harm you and hurt you, who now knows that you hate them and you're trying to get them hanged.
Mm.
You've ended up in a much worse situation than you were at the beginning.
Mm.
That's
It's
why,
interesting.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
why
sorry.
these moments of witch hunting panic are unusual, but so deep and interesting for what happens to change that round. So we think about the Hopkins hunt, we think about witchcraft panics in Germany, in the Basque, in Scandinavia. Suddenly, these really intense moments where the normal limits on trials
Mm.
break down, and suddenly accusations are wildly successful, and people
Mm.
accusations build on accusations, but they might not last long. The one in Great Yarmouth lasts a summer, and by the autumn of that year, they go actually. Well, sorry, by the spring of the next year, they go. This was kind of a bad idea. Um, but that's where you start
I.
having support networks. So I'll probably get onto later. People like
Mm.
witch finders, witch prickers, midwives to
Well,
search the
we will
bodies.
get there in a few minutes, but
Mhm.
it's interesting you bring up Scandinavia because, especially after Christianity, because here in Scandinavia we have the indigenous Sami people, and in Snorri, I don't know if you read his work or not, but he in Snorri he refers And I believe this is special because after they become a Christian population, they are kind of superstitious, etc. But I'm not going to get into details on why, because I shouldn't tell you. I'm not that into the Viking Age, to be honest. But which is probably why I haven't covered it as much as I probably should in on this podcast. But it's the Sami people, which was the indigenous kind of Native American tribe, if to describe them in the best, easiest sort of way, they were accused of being witches, especially in the Snorri saga, and they were accused of having these magical powers. And I believe this was especially the case after the Christianization of Scandinavia that they had, because they lived far north, and they had the shamans and the religious beliefs that they had, and they were persecuted pretty much up until fairly recently, just in the 1970s. In Norway, you had all these people protested, for example, the dam that were going to be built. I believe I think it was Alta. I'm not quite sure where it was, but they were persecuted pretty much fell quite far away until fairly recently and looked down upon. So they were easy to believe that they were witches, that they had these magical powers, and that the shamans there were had all this magical power that, like I said.
I'm hoping Sarah will remember this because I attended, I think, WitchCon last year, 2023, and we had a very interesting speaker discussing about how people would approach the Sami. That again, it crosses a line of acceptability and unacceptability.
Yeah.
How can they be prosecuted? Are they witches? Because again, it's very much like a demonic power, the way they draw magical beliefs and patterns from the world and try to prophesy things, but also they're kind of outside the Christian world. How do they fit into that patternation? And certainly people were using them and their ability to prophesy, comparable to, wise women astrologers in European traditions. That yeah, they're a really interesting example of this.
I know
Um,
this isn't your field. Some people aren't your field, but and I really want to cover them one day. But it's a topic I find interesting to bring up anyway when it comes to this. I mean, spoke about this the last time as well.
I think
That
there's something
how
interesting as well. A comparison point with the tribes that some of the European settlers first meet in North America. I
yeah.
think Aztecs are just generally seen to be evil for their kind of cannibalism and human sacrifice. But there are certain tribes in New England whose beliefs were seen to be quite demonic, that they weren't just praying to nature spirits, but to devils. And that certainly creates some of the early tension there around things like King Philip's War, which feeds into what's going on in Salem. That concern about the country you're in is kind of still inhabited by agents of the devil. And we have that kind of complexity there with Tituba, the enslaved person who'd been brought over from Bermuda, and her role in kind of her beliefs, how they playing into it, and that line of later also beliefs like voodoo, which mix West African and Christian traditions. There's that hint of the demonic in them as well for those people who don't understand them from outside it. So yeah, that line I think is really fascinating in a way that's kind of different from what's going on inside Europe.
Hmm. Let's talk a little bit
Oh,
about.
before I forget, also, you're probably not here listening as well.
I know. Again, I know this
D-
isn't really your
yeah,
field, and I'm a little bit embarrassed because I just go real quick to the bathroom
of
while you
course.
talk.
Well, I'll
I'm
just
so sorry
mention.
about this,
No, no,
but
no, you go, you go.
it's while you talk,
Yeah,
while you talk,
I've got
why
a,
don't you talk a little
I'm
bit
gonna
about
give a shout out to
indigenous
my colleague
people?
Chris
Yeah,
Joby while you're away. Then.
yeah. So if you wouldn't mind keeping the conversation
Yep.
going while I'm just briefly away, I'm gonna try to be as quick as I can. But you should be entertaining people,
Mm.
and this is live, so it's quite tricky to post this. And I'm sorry again
Don't
to
worry,
our
don't worry, don't worry.
listeners, but
Um,
you keep it, and I'll be right back.
yeah,
So thank you so much.
if chat wants to put in their favourite witch, I'll try and rate them. I don't have got witches here, but no. So yeah, Dr. Chris Joby, he's a really interesting expert in everything Dutch outside the Netherlands, and he's done some recent work on Taiwan and the Dutch reactions to native beliefs there. Absolutely fascinating work. And again, their approach to seeing some of the indigenous people of Taiwan's beliefs as demonic, I think it's another interesting line there. I've not really explored it. I know more people will. And I'm looking forward to whenever Chris gets the chance to write about this in between everything else he's doing. But definitely, he's always worth talking to. But yeah, it's that line between acceptability and acceptability, that marginal peoples, very important to witchcraft. So yes, anyone with any more questions while we wait for our host? Oh, no, he's almost back. Uh,
Okay, I'm back. What did I miss?
I was just
Just a second.
praising my colleague, Dr. Chris Joby, who's an expert
Yeah.
in everything Dutch outside the Netherlands. He produces some very interesting work. He's been looking at the reaction of the Dutch when they arrive in Taiwan to the indigenous religion, and sometimes they frame that as demonic or
Mm,
pretty close to witchcraft.
mm. Let's talk a little bit again. Sorry if I'm repeating now, but let's talk a little bit about Native American indigenous magic and how people who came to the new world, how they received viewed Native Americans and do with magic and witchcraft there. Oh, thank you, by the way, Mary.
So yeah, there is something to the way, again, framing magic around the world afterwards that we there's a tendency to read it back in their own ways. Like we're talking about that translation of the Bible under King James, "Thou shalt not suffer the witch," which is slightly different from the sort of contemporary magical beliefs. So yeah, I think that there's something to it. But again, not my area of expertise.
Mm,
So I will always surrender that ground to those who know that area a little bit better.
mm. So let's go a little bit back until UK because again that is your main focus. So let's talk a little bit about how we again we are drawing back from the episode we made last year. So, but how easy was it? I'm sorry if I repeat myself, but how easy was it to denounce someone as a witch? Like I'm trying to draw the same parallel here. Is I did not like your wife, for example, and say I wanted to get rid of her because she was in the way, and I wanted to denounce her as a witch. How easy would it been for me to
Very
say, "Oh, your
difficult. Yeah,
wife is a witch"?
very difficult. So again, first of all, you have to get to the point where you feel you're confident enough to make an accusation. So you have to be pretty concerned. When you make that accusation, then you have to go to a proper court case. So again, it's being handled by the borough sessions, by the county court. So this is a proper trial. You have to have a judge. So again, if it's a county court, it needs to be a judge from London. So he's going to be harder to convince that this person is guilty compared to someone who's local. When we go things like the Pendle witch trials and others, people have had suspicions about families for a couple of generations. Sometimes they're suspicious of them. This means nothing to someone who doesn't know them. You have a jury made up of local people. So again, they need convincing, but they might be of a different class. So again, the case I look at in Great Yarmouth in the borough sessions there, this is a pretty wealthy town. All the members of the court are made up of members of the merchant elite. These are wealthy individuals who are literate, well read. They, will need a lot of convincing normally. Then,
Mm,
obviously, it's quite a harsh requirement initially. So the 1563 Act requires you to have done magic that harms someone. So you need to be able to prove it. So there are supposed to be spiritual proofs. You need people to give evidence. The best evidence is a confession, but most of the time, you're not going to confess to it. That's quite unusual. You might
mm.
try and seek evidence from
Again, if you are accused of being a witch and you say no, I'm not a witch, so leave me alone. How is it? How did the jury? Because it's probably most men, right? How did they fight? How
the
easy was
jury.
it
Yeah,
to
entirely meant.
convince them? How easy was it to convince the jury that no, I'm not a witch, and just leave me alone? And let me do my business. So how easy was it?
Pretty difficult. I mean, James Sharp, in his wonderful book, The Bewitching of Anne Gunter, gives us a process of a failed accusation. That the man, James Gunter, he stabbed someone, he's got in trouble with the local community, so he's trying to get his own back on people he's seen as enemy. He gets his daughter to provide the best evidence she can. So he gets her to basically fake a high quality bewitchment. So she has to swallow pins to stick them up. She, has fits. She follows all the previous guide. But people are suspicious of it. King James, um, takes a personal interest. He gets a bishop to get involved. He has his attractive young minister to talk to Anne Gunter. Anne Gunter eventually reveals she's been faking it all. So yeah, there's a quite a lot of hoops you need to go through. You see it's slightly different in Scotland, where accusations have been more successful, which is more decentralised. We have a local lord running a court. You have the local people prosecuting, bringing in evidence. But again, even there, it's not always successful. So again, that difficulty is there. Most of the time, again, the methods you're allowed on the continent, so torture, you aren't allowed to torture the accused under English law. So that means you're limited the amount of evidence you can get. You're having to rely on people's voices about people making accusations there. Yeah, Marianne brings up the Timber witch trials. I don't know them personally, but yes, Edmund Fairfax accusing his daughter of being a witch. People would lose quite often. It's a difficult thing to prove. That's why the role of someone like a witch finder is so important. That expert witness.
So let's talk a little bit. You mentioned that a little bit earlier, but I want to touch a little bit more detail on the trials, the famous two trials you have, like drowning and burning. Let's talk about a little bit through the process of how you were judged, you were found guilty, and if the witch floats, if she floats, she's a witch. Which obviously most did not float and they drowned. So, and if you were
Well, they didn't
floating,
drown.
you were
That's the
burned
important
at the
thing to
stake.
remember. So it's you've got the most famous case of this is part of the Hopkins witch hunt. Is about a man
Mm.
called John Lowes. He's an 80-year-old vicar from the local village called Brandeston. He's quite disliked because again he's a bit dodgy, a bit of a drunk, a very high Anglican in a very Puritan area. So they take him to Framlingham, which is a castle, and it's got a moat. So it's not a particularly deep piece of water. They put a rope across it. So again, a very famous image we can find of that. The rope secures the alleged witch. So by holding onto the rope, that means if your body sinks down, the water is accepting you. So you're not a witch, but you're not going to drown because you're safely on that rope. If you are allegedly a witch, your body floats up. The water is rejecting it. But you're still holding onto that rope, so you'll be dragged in, and then that spiritual proof is taken. Now, under English law, that's not accessible. Again, people might carry it out amongst themselves, but it's generally frowned upon, despite King James saying this is a fantastic methodology. Now, the other element, which is very important to English witch hunting, and we've not yet mentioned at all, but I ought to because it's great fun, is the familiar. So the
Yeah,
familiar
I
is a
was wanting to come to
spirit
that. Yeah.
given to them by the devil to do magical harm. So we have evidence of we have accusations where they're being sent out to sink ships to protect them in battle. The Matthew Hopkins, the witchfinder, alleged a big black dog was sent after him in the dark to try and persuade him to go away, to threaten him. These are really important elements of that. And again, the Witchcraft Act changes at the beginning of the 17th century to include the invocation or raising of any spirits to do harm is also part of this punishment, partly something that you can be killed for. So this is, again, the idea that it's not just you doing the magic, it's your familiar. But that means there's also another source of spiritual proof. Because the familiar doesn't just exist on ether. It's not just, as despite being a magical creature, it needs to feed on human blood. To feed on human blood, it needs an extra teat on your body.
Who are the people coming up with this? Was it the church? Was it the main
This
the
just seems to
village
be a
people?
popular belief that's emerged during this period. it's codified by the likes of codified by the law and by James in the Daemonology, but it seems to have existed already for quite some time. But this is also, it's a particularly English part of witchcraft, because I love that there's unique elements to different regions. The most interesting, I think, is probably the Russians, who, again, it tends to be male witches cursing women, and the women are cursed to the point they have fits, seizures, they kind of get Tourette's, they can't enter sacred places. In Normandy, again, it's mostly male witches cursing women. But yes, the English, they're frightened of these familiars. So you need to find the teeth in the body. So that's where the midwives come in, because they know what a woman's body should look like, and they spot anything unusual that shouldn't be there. So that's brings in the role of midwives to search the bodies. But again, that's not allowed normally under English law. It's only the unusualness of the witch hunt that allows that to happen.
And again, I know this your area is more witches, but I want to ask, what's the idea of because it's Halloween? I don't ask. What's the idea of vampires a thing back in those in the 15th or 16th century? And of course, because you brought up the idea of familiars, and for me personally, the what we do in the shadows is a perfect example of vampires using familiars. But was vampires a bit fair back in the 15th and 16th century?
Not in England, but pity you missed today the spooky conference organised by the University of, I think it's Portsmouth. They had a one-day conference and they brought in a fascinating historian. Give me but one moment and I'll see if I can. Who was it today who spoke on Romanian?
Because of course there was famous one, and who's inspired by the real Vlad Dracul, and who of course was a opponent of Mehmed II. Is one of the most famous vampires of all time. But
who else have you heard of who bathes
yeah,
in blood in Romania?
yeah.
So
But
there's
was
Elizabeth
vampires a
Bathory.
real thing fair back then in Europe or Eastern
The,
Europe?
the Romanians, the Romanian Orthodox community, as part of the as part of the Austrian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian kingdom at that point, noted that Alexander Solly today was discussing how there were allegedly magic users, evil magic users, who would suck on blood or use blood for renewing themselves. So this is obviously what's alleged by Elizabeth Bathory in Bohemia. But again, it's something that's been part of this community's belief. These magic users are doing that. So again, always worth talking to a variety of researchers on this. Again, I hadn't heard of this until today, so we're getting new information to the both of us.
Good timing, perfect timing.
So big shout out to Spooky Conference. I hope there's a Spooky Conference 2025. Should be even more fascinating.
So let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned him already, but let's talk a little bit more about Hopkins. And wasn't just a loony trying. I want to know what, like you said, there were some intelligent people there that actually believed these things. And was Hopkins just a loony trying to get as many women as he could on the stage, or how?
Well, let's
Was
go
he a
back there
quite
because
intelligent
there's
in
something we need to
person?
go back to in terms of punishment. So
Yeah.
in England, generally witches are hung, they're hanged, because again they're committing a treason against God. There are a couple who are burned, but they're burned for the crime of killing their husbands. So again, a kind of heresy of breaking the patriarchal rules. In Germany and in France, it's treated as a form of heresy, so therefore they are burnt on the stake. So we just need to be really careful about that, because otherwise I'll get overly annoyed. It's not good for my blood pressure. But yes, we do hang them.
Accepted.
Exactly. We tend to hang witches in England normally. So that punishment is then granted by the court. So that's carried out. For some reason, I've got one person that was too old for it and just wasn't hanged. No idea why. So we've got our process, then we've got our witch finder. So there have been a series of people hired for witch hunting. Actually, one of the most interesting things is the Inquisition, generally against that sort of thing. They thought it was too superstitious. they tend to quash
Bet you
witchcraft
they don't
accusations.
expect that comment.
Exactly, exactly. Um, but we think about the Malleus Maleficiarum. That's again by a couple of Dominican friars going around pursuing witches.
Because of course it is.
Um, there are elements of that with the court. We also see that happening in Germany. Um, Again, I know some people who are studying the Newcastle case, which rely on Scottish witch prickers. So people who'd use a pin to test these witches' marks, where the familiars are feeding from. But Hopkins and his assistant John Stern are particularly interesting because they are obviously very well educated. So we know that for a start because they both published their own pamphlets after the witch hunt, justifying everything they've done. So Hopkins
If I
is
may be so bold, just because you're educated doesn't mean necessarily quite smart. Because we see a lot of
well, they
people
managed
who
to
are
justify.
I mean, you are
Yeah.
smart, but you are no, you have even educated people can, and there are educated people. To use an example today, who support Trump in the presidential election, which when you know they shouldn't, but it's. So there are educated people who doesn't that was it quite a smart man, Hopkins, or how not to say it wasn't just a loony who just wanted to hang witches and women.
Well, the first thing to note, he was both the son of a vicar and the stepson of a vicar. He was brought up in a highly religious way. So obviously he's imbued with a biblical sense. And he's imbued with the Bible in the border zone between Essex and Suffolk. So if you know your East Anglia, it's very much an important trading area. It's an area which is deeply pious at this point. And it's a bit also kind of a bit in rebellion against King Charles I, whose policies they don't care for.
Mm.
And there's also an issue of nearby Colchester, which is the big county town of Essex, is got a couple of very important pseudo-Catholic, crypto-Catholic nobility running it. There's a lot of fear of those, that they're going to overturn things. The time they're brought up is a time of cataclysm in the world. And if you're on the coastal region of Britain, you're connected to in a way you aren't in the middle of England. So you imagine they've got emigres, people who were part of the Dutch Great War against the Catholic Spanish. You've got Huguenots from France who've come over to do trade and to bring their new techniques over. I think at one point, Norwich, where I come from, something between a third to two-thirds of the population was French at one point. Was stranger, so sorry, more Dutch, but yeah, there's this vast population. Even in Great Yarmouth, if we look at there was a quite a large Dutch population. That war has come awfully close. Even Charles's failed attempt to fight the French and to get involved against the Spanish have involved ships from nearby. So he is part of this worldview. But he's relatively young. I think we generally say in sort of early 20s. So someone who hasn't necessarily seen that, but he's heard the stories of the Spanish Armada. He's heard the story of against the war against the world, and he's brought up to see himself as part of this. His status is kind of again he's an awkward. He's the third son. He can't go into the priesthood. He's instead a tavern owner. So he's got an important community role. He's connected into that community. He's well read. He's looking for his chance to get involved in this conflict between good and evil. And suddenly it happens when there are these accusations of witchcraft. When he believes he's being pursued by familiars, when he's found the evidence in court that makes accusations easier. So partly again, this is about the apocalyptic nature of the English Civil War. By 1645, the war is on a knife edge. There's been the North has been subdued by Parliament at the Battle of Marston Moor. And then later next year, Naseby is confirmed. But in that summer of 1644 at Lostwithiel, the
If I
parliamentary.
may interrupt, you have
Yeah.
another comment by Mary who says, I was going to mention the John Low's water method that was
Mm,
mentioned in the Wishfinder General's movie. Perhaps one of the few movies where we see some representation of Matthew Hopkins and John Stern.
mm. Again, that's a wonderful film for its psychodrama and to try and understand it. I think the only issue is that Hopkins is shown as Vincent Price, one of his best performances, but he's kind of a creepy old man. Where the real Matthew Hopkins is very young, very brave, and again he's traveling through a war-torn country. Again, East Anglia's generally been quite stable and safe. There's been a couple of attempted uprisings. They've gone badly, and suddenly the east coast of it seen as a possible invasion coast, but there's been no invasion. And again, they've shown the swimming, but again, there's almost a sadistic. There's things like branding women, the way that they are tortured, which doesn't quite fit with Hopkins' methodology. He himself doesn't get his hands dirty in quite that way. Instead, he's hiring these midwives to do so for him. They're also complex. Again, he's very well paid for this job. He's a gentleman. He rides a horse. He wears gentleman's clothes. He stays in the nice taverns. But that's kind of what's expected. But that does mean he has to be paid a lot for this. And again, one of the concerns about when he stops being effective, why the witch hunt burns out, is you're paying a lot of money for his services, and he's then not providing the successful convictions that justify bringing him in. When he does succeed at the beginning, it's because he's able to provide the evidence. So we've mentioned the swimming, we've mentioned the searching the body for the extra teat. The other one that's quite interesting is watching and warding. So this is where you keep the alleged witch awake for 3 or 4 days straight to see if the familiar comes and comes to feed, because it's going to be hungry after 3 or 4 days. But that is a form of psychological torture. I don't know if you've ever been awake 3 or 4 days straight, but it does funny things to the human brain. You become so much more suggestible. You become delusional, which means that if you have someone asking you constantly, are you a witch? Do you have these visions? Do you do this? Do you do that? You'll confess. And then suddenly, a few days when you're recovered, sometimes we get occasional recanting. People don't suddenly think, well, that was nonsense. But it's a bit too late, because the confession is really important. So remember we were talking about how difficult it was to get accusations?
Yeah.
Well, if you confess, that's the best evidence. The person said it. We've got a scribe there, they've written it all down, they've spoken out of court. And again, these confessions seem to be helped by ministers there, by Hopkins himself. It means that these confessions, to my mind, are quite often shaped by the accusers. They're given the kind of shape that you need to get to effectively answer the questions required in the court of law, but also answering the questions in a way that creates this biblical narrative that they want. So, the kind of bewitchments there. But also, it's really important because when the confession happens, it needs to have an appropriate effect on the victim. Like suddenly they will rise from 18 months of sickness. They are cured. Another ineffable proof of God's divine plan that you break the spell and suddenly, again, is it a placebo effect? Is it, do people tell that? What's the psychological thing going there? It's hard to interpret and over-interpret in our modern mindset. But certainly for the people living there, this is golden proof.
I want to talk a little bit about the method of torture, because it's easy to confess anything, and anyone who read history or knows that if you've been tortured, you can easily confess to anything. If you've been tortured long enough, that is, and some people have not, but that's kind of the minority. But it's easy to confess if you're not used to being tortured. As horrible as that is to say, but how many witches were, confessed under torture and said, "Oh yes, I'm a witch. Just make the, just give the people what they want." They put it that way.
Well, this is the question. Because again, the panic overall, we can talk about thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands across Europe. In England, though, the Hopkins hunt, we've heard allegations of thousands. I think it's probably closer to the hundreds. I mean, it's still obviously a tragedy, but it is possible to exaggerate quite how deep it went. This is a 2-year process in East Anglia, and by the end of 1645, it's kind of burnt out. There's again much smaller communities. The big accusations happen very early on. There are secondary ways. We see in 1650 there's another accusations in Kent and in Newcastle around, but again, hundreds rather than thousands. And again, it's that issue of torture. The Hopkins himself, in his self-justifying pamphlet, Discovery of Witches, claims he never involved himself in that. There are also accusations that Hopkins had the devil's book. He had a list of all the witches, so that's why he knew who was who. But again, he rejected that. But certainly, yeah, it must be something. There is something to it. The system of the several different going on there. Because of the Civil War, we aren't getting the judges from London, so we're getting local people, and such as their military commanders. The wonderfully named Harbottle Grimstone in Ipswich, a military expert rather than a legal expert, carrying out the trials. In Great Yarmouth, we have the recorder who's been there before, but again, he hasn't got as much overview and scrutiny in a situation of this conflict, because again, you don't really there's plague, there's suffering. Again, people are more desperate, I think, because there isn't enough food, so you get more of a demand for charity, more pressure on resources. I mean, accusations are easier to make, but even then, people very quickly, within
Again, most people who read history, and especially during the Enlightenment history, knows, and we will get back to the Enlightenment in a few minutes. But they know that the torture is not an effective method to get accusation, because they will confess eventually to anything that the torturer wants. And again, Picard in the Four Lights scene is a famous example of that, where he confessed that he would have, you know, he was just moments away from confessing that there were four lights, not five, in a famous episodes. And it's a silly comparison, I'm sure, but even he as well talked about how even they found out that torture was not an effective method to get confession out of anyone. But like I said, everyone knows that torture doesn't really work the way you want to.
yeah. Well, again, it's why it's not normally acceptable in English law, even at this point. So again, why these situations are so unusual, that you have this involvement of a witch finder, of a witch pricker, of people watching and warding, and it's ruinously expensive for the time. You're relying on expert midwives to do this research for you, that it makes it untenable. So I think so. The worst German witch hunts are where, partly so, the money received from the capture of goods of the alleged witches pays for more investigation, so it gives it a perverse incentive to continue. But that's so unusual. But it's
Where
about a
people back
breakdown in order that allows it.
before the Enlightenment, were people back then even aware that torture
Oh,
didn't
definitely,
really
definitely. The fact that Hopkins has to justify himself in his discovery of witches and claims he wasn't engaged in torture suggests again there's already a sense that he's crossing a line. We have pamphlets of the time, Thomas Scott writing about this, saying, what's going on here is dangerous and involves a corruption of the legal process. People were very much aware of, that this is a very, very dangerous line, and that, Hopkins at various times is crossing it.
Let's talk. I think it's time to talk a little bit about the Enlightenment, and of course, because that's a big part of the end of witchcraft. And of course, it starts with the elite as always, and then it kind of goes down. But let's talk about how people kind of got away from the idea that witches. It's not
In
really a
England,
thing.
it's
So
it's a
let's talk a little
yeah.
bit about how the end of witch belief. I want to throw back, because there's one thing we haven't talked about it yet, and now I'm probably skipping ahead of being ahead of myself, but we're going to talk about the Enlightenment a little bit later. I kind of changed my mind.
No, don't worry, don't worry.
Sorry about that, but I want to talk a little bit about the Salem witch trials a
Yes.
little bit,
Well,
because we
Salem, I
have
think,
that's kind of
and
the
the end of
elephant of the room here.
Salem and the witch hunt, and the end of the witch hunts go together really nicely.
Yeah,
So, in
because
some
it's kind of
ways,
the elephant of the room.
Salem is unusual. Again, I'm not the expert on this. I know Sarah will scream at me if I don't get this quite right. But Salem, I think, is interesting because it is an isolated, godly congregational community in New England. So again, there are lots of theories which have been discredited. Obviously, we probably all heard about ergot, the idea that the people most affected were people living on marshy ground, so their grain was going a bit weird, so they got LSD in it. There's not enough LSD in ergot to produce that kind of effect. But what there is a lot of paranoia. Partly, again, there's a weakness of government. There should be a governor for the region, but due to the crisis of the Williamite Wars in England, they haven't got one. They haven't got anyone over them. They're down to their own resources. They're stretched thin. The weather is bad. The 1690s, we don't tend to think about it in this way, but it is some of the peak of the disaster of this ice age. I think Jan Mickelson writes about that really interestingly. There's flooding, there's disasters in England, but New England, it means really harsh weather, and it's a very harsh place to live already. On top of that, it's still recovering from the disaster that was King Philip's War. They've been fighting the Native Americans in a fierce battle for supremacy. The Native Americans have forced them back in various places, which means, again, they feel terror. This is a community on the edge. A community on the edge that hasn't got leadership to go with it, so therefore turning on each other. It's also interesting, again, there's other stuff that's going on in English. We've got the Bishop Joseph Glanville is concerned with spiritual proof. So not necessarily the proof that we were talking about with Hopkins, where you're looking for the marks, but evidence of what people can see. So what's unusual is we have a variety of children who claim they've seen something, linked to Tituba, who we mentioned, the native, so the enslaved person who's been brought over from Bermuda might have slightly different beliefs. There seems to be inspiring, so the actions there. We have some extremely brave people who aren't willing to admit to torture. People who are squashed with rocks rather than admit to what's going on. They're caught in this sort of pressure cooker. And so that way, accusations very quickly rise up, linked to very strong religious beliefs. But again, this isn't something new. This has been happening across New England from the 1640s onwards. Again, talk to Thou Shalt Not. The Witch Hunt podcast. They go into so much detail. Also, the wonderful story that Louise, the name eludes me now. My apologies, Louise. There's so many people doing excellent work on these accusations across this region, and a lot of these are beliefs that have been transposed from England. There are problems with these religious communities that are small, but allow people to go wild. From the edge of communities, you can just move out. You aren't forced together to be obedient, to be worship as one. That allows these nonconformist beliefs to emerge, which the witch is only a little step away from, and with it sort of the dread of the wilds there with it. So yes, there's all those elements tied together, but also the fact it becomes such a cause célèbre and represents the end of these kind of beliefs, represents, as we talk about, this idea of the Enlightenment, but also how these beliefs have gone from being cutting edge modern beliefs that reject the previous superstition of the Catholic Church and the medieval belief in magic, and are now becoming outdated and unfashionable. Certainly, they're more in Salem and in colonial North America because of the way that these communities saw themselves. They're more interested in them. Joseph Glanville is still believing them in England, but again, his beliefs are shifting, trying to find different ways to proof rather than the kind of ways that they had during the Hopkins hunt. I think that's the biggest issue before we even think about the Enlightenment or the idea of the scientific revolution. It's fashion. The Puritans by 1650 are looking tired. There was the idea you're going to have the Civil War was fought by people wanting a Presbyterian government, but by 1647 the army has rejected them and they want something different. They want a more plurality of Puritan beliefs. So the idea of a dangerous heretic within preventing Presbyterianism is old hat. People, it's not going to happen. So there are fears of people like the Quakers as nonconformists. At one point, the devil is the great Quaker. The Quakers spread so quickly. This is something the wonderful, wonderful Peter Elmer writes so much about. I always recommend him about the Quakers and their secret sects, the way that they suddenly people convert. Are they bewitching people? But they can't be quelled either, and trying to hunt them is unpopular. Well, it is actually deeply popular, but it's difficult to do. But by the Restoration, we have now the Anglicans are back in charge. The Anglicans have brought an end to a quite unpopular by the end Puritan regime that, tumble down Dick, Richard Cromwell, the fail of the return of the Rump, the fail of the army. The king offers stability. And also, Charles II is not his father. He's cunning, he's ruthless, he's willing to change and chop and change. But he brings a certain stability in a way the last few years of the Protectorate did not. So this means the Protectorate is now seen through jaundiced eyes. The classic example of this is a man called Samuel Butler, who writes this long poem called Hudibras that mocks the parliamentarian regime. It mocks all the Puritans. How cynical, how stupid. This is something that's even happening back in the 1640s, but he's the one who's codifying it. And he codifies some of the myths about Hopkins as a superstitious idiot. That he's either secretly working for the devil, or he's just getting idiot old women who are helpless. He's torturing them for the sake of it. And worst of all, he suggests that Hopkins himself is hung as a witch. The real Hopkins, rather ignominiously, likely catches tuberculosis from his adventures with the marshy, unpleasant bits of East Anglia, dies back in his hometown, having written his pamphlet, rather pathetically rejected. But in Hudibras' poem, he's hung as a witch himself. The whole thing is ridiculous. It's a joke. It's not something to be taken seriously, the whole idea of witches. And this is something that continues in the Restoration theatre. There's performance of Macbeth, which is sort of over the top, witches being swung around. They're no longer something really threatening. They're something dramatic and fun. But they're not. They're. But again, witchcraft beliefs don't die away. Up to the 19th century, we've got people mutilating faces, trying to swim alleged witches. The belief doesn't go away, but it becomes unfashionable. No judge is going to take it seriously, despite
But
Matthew Hale.
how does it become so much stronger in the New World versus England, and where it's kind of dying away, and that you said it become old-fashioned? So how does it compare to the New World? Why is it so much stronger there? Is it because they are in a new place and they need something to believe in, or is it something different that causes the idea of witchcraft that it kind of become that causes the Salem witch trials again?
I think partly New England is a very Puritan world that sees trying to reject, is trying to accept what England's rejected. It's for them often that's the idea that they are the perfected version, what England should have been in the Protectorate, a godly community that's concerned with their soul. It's
And
concerned
if I
with.
may interfere, I forgot to ask you as well, how much of this is biblical and religious belief that causes the idea of Salem witch trials? I just thought I insert this in because
Yeah,
I'm curious to know.
I would definitely say it draws a lot from biblical beliefs and biblical fears about the witches and about their connections. Um, yeah, there's the real fear of the demonic enemy within. So again, it's concerned with witchcraft. It's concerned with the devil and the struggle between God and the devil going on in their community, and the millennium. The sense that the end times are imminent, and so with it, the cataclysmic God battle between God and the devil. So the devil will have agents everywhere trying to prevent that. But also, again, there's a lot of reflection involved in Puritanism. It requires you to be constantly aware of yourself, aware of your beliefs. These are the first people who write diaries as a way to try and understand their own souls. That these people, and constantly trying to pray together, work community. But it also means that when things don't go right, there's a search for divine reasons for that, and with that, obviously, the opportunity it could be for the devil as well. Um,
And yeah,
divine
sorry to interrupt.
providence.
Just run to the bathroom real quick again, and I'll be right back. If you just wouldn't mind keep talking about it, please.
Okay.
I'll
Um,
be right back.
yes,
I'm sorry. I draw a bad bladder sometimes, so it's. I'm sorry. I'm embarrassed, but it is what it is. So
it
I'll
is.
be
It is.
right back. Just keep talking. Keep
I
entertaining.
I think Robert Eggers' The Witch is supposed to be a very good representation of that fear, and that way it can worm its way into communities. I don't know if anyone else has any other recommendations in terms of film versions. And again, I find New England fascinating for that. The way it's both meant to try and see itself as a perfection of England and its beliefs, but also the way it's about the fear of falling below that standard and expectation. So yeah, it's asking a lot of questions of us. But it's not my area of specialty. I always more to read about that. Perfect timing.
Yeah. So again, what did I miss?
Mm.
What
I
did
mean,
I miss?
no, I think you're just mentioning Robert Eggers' The Witch, trying to draw that as a psychological drama within a family, within a community. That I think is makes
Hmm.
that area so fascinating.
Hmm. So and this brings me to the Enlightenment. I kind of I would hesitate calling it the like you point out the end of witch hunt, but let's talk about how the Enlightenment changes the view of witches and witchcraft in society.
Well, I think the first thing it does, it changes the state. So as we can see, is that as the 17th century comes to an end, as we this 18th century, we see the development of an increasingly intrusive state. Localities aren't expected to govern themselves in quite the same way. Scotland becomes centralised. Scandinavia becomes centralised. Germany, different princedoms become centralised. And with that central authority is going to be a lot more suspicious of things like witch hunts and witchcraft, because witchcraft is often used as God's judgment. It's all very well if you're setting up a new regime, but if an existing regime and there's suddenly the agents of the devil everywhere, it looks bad. It's a bad look. Cross arms. It doesn't look good for your state. So with that, there will be a tendency to try and quash them. Also, again, that centralized state means there's more attempt to gain uniformity. In England, ironically, it's with the Bill of Rights, with the involvement of William and Mary. There's more toleration for other Protestants, but certainly, yes, there's a move away from that kind of confessional conflict. Also, again, Europe is just tired of it. You've had the horrific 80 Years' War, 30 Years' War, French Wars of Religion, the time of troubles in Russia. There's a calming there. There's a change in the climate. The world becomes slowly warmer, more stable. The world opens up. There isn't the same kind of pressures on people. But with that, yes, I think there are questions about the scientific revolution, the kind of fashion for science and rationalism, which means we have that idea of Newton's clockwork universe. That is, first of all, it's the end of the age of miracles. That's why people like Quakers are seen as so dangerous. They believe that they have healing powers, powers of dispossession, powers to magically heal and to exorcise these demonic influences. But that's not seen as particularly fashionable. That's again dangerous radicalism. For the 18th century gentleman, the world becomes one of gravity, of scientific logic that offers less space. The miracles of the Bible have finished, or even more, we get some cynicism about the Bible. I think it was, can't remember which one of the founding fathers of America tries to rewrite the Bible to make it more logical. Something
Was
which,
the kind of people like you seem to try to imply that people took it less seriously as they used to before that.
The
It
the
wasn't
people the people
it
in
wasn't as
charge,
literal as they used to do. You,
yeah, the people in charge of states certainly become less engaged with magic. So again, you think of the Civil War, King Charles, and a lot of the parliamentarian leaders were all turning to William Lilly, astrologer. But by the end of the 17th century, um, the court astrologers have become court astronomers. They've found the evidence. They've got much better equipment. They're looking at the stars and looking at them in terms of there's so much detail there. It doesn't make sense for the dome with the stars our astrologers are relying on. But of course, it doesn't die away. We still have astrologers today. But it's for whatever reason, it's not seen as something people take seriously,
hmm.
which is yeah.
So that brings me to my next question, and that is the 21st and 20th century. And I know, again, I know this is not your area, and we're gonna run it up soon because we're going at this quite a while now. So, but let's talk about witchcraft in the 21st century, and I think we talked about this a little bit last year as well. How it's especially in third world African country, it's quite a strong belief in witchcraft. So let's talk a little bit about modern belief in witchcraft and witch hunts. And again, I want to draw a little bit attention to media as well, because people call, especially famous people, how someone been attacked. They're told, "Oh, it's a," and again, Donald Trump especially calls this, "Oh, it's a witch hunt. It's a witch hunt. It's there they are hunting me down." It's become kind of a term for people being feeling a bit chased, or being attached on social media, especially. So let's talk a little bit about modern witchcraft and how and again in third world.
Mm.
So let's talk a little bit how about this,
So
if you don't
Dr.
mind.
Leo Igwe has done some fantastic research about this, about trying to promote rationalism, because again, there are still concerns in Christian and other communities where you have a combination of both existing indigenous beliefs about magic. I think a friend of mine from Ghana showed me this fantastic documentary about the rainmakers, who are seen as vital for anyone who's an event organizer in Ghana to ensure that there is no rain for their events and there's rain for their rivals' events. These beliefs are deeply held, can be linked to lots of different tribal religions and traditions, but these come into contact as well with Christian and Muslim beliefs and creates tension there. That there are fears about people like albinos, about others that they can use magic and they can use it harmfully. Ronald Hutton, of course, the expert, the most well-dressed historian of the early modern era,
Yeah.
about the different ways that people understand witchcraft and understand witch hunting. Um, and it can differ from community to community. The rainmakers aren't seen as a particularly dangerous group, but others obviously are. And again, a very evangelical sense of Christianity there, a belief in an age of miracles exists. And that's true as well in America, where we see evangelicals who are still concerned about this cataclysmic battle between God and the devil, into which everything is applied, be it politics, be it.
And I want to ask, if I may interfere, how do you, as a historian of witchcraft, view this evangelical belief that people still believe in witches, and that they still believe that they have this dark power of Satan among them? What are your thoughts on this as a historian of this topic?
Whew, that's difficult. Like again, I don't think we can invalidate someone's experience. It is very presumptuous, but obviously these are can become immensely dangerous beliefs. And again, we see it with other ideologies too, where again, if we're going to turn to the idea of the political witch hunt,
Yeah.
that ever since, in particular, I think it's Miller's The Crucible, which turned the Salem witch hunt into a metaphor for the Red Scare in 1950s America. That we can see how purity culture, the requirement of a fear of an enemy within, trying to undermine the ideological pressure towards a new world, can easily be transformed into this pursuit of horrendous violence as a way to purge. We think of the panics of Stalin. We think of the panics, that have happened even in our times about people who are seen as potentially dangerous. That there's something deep in the human psyche about that fear of the enemy within, which and the witch hunt again is used as a way to maybe belie real fears of people who can be dangerous. We again, obviously, with Trump, there's that concern there of how much of his campaign is infiltrated by Russian influence or others.
Hmm.
I think again, there's that sense of, is there Trump derangement syndrome? Do we overreact to these things rather than deal with the real symptom, with the real root
Hmm.
cause of, authoritarianism? It's easy to just go, oh, this is all about Russia, rather than about the foibles within the people next to us. Is it easier to deal with it like that?
Yeah.
That's I think quite compelling for that. But at the same time, yeah, there are there's more than enough evidence there are the fifth columnist enemies within involved in this. But again, this is the old dichotomy that one, communities need to exist together. And we exist better when we work together. We live with the people next to us. We may not have to agree with them. We may not have to be neighbourly to them all the time. But if we treat them as a danger, that drives us into paranoia. It puts them in danger and potentially puts us in danger too. Um, yeah, it's a difficult balancing act, and you have to commend. Yeah, you have to commend people who, like Leo, try and find ways to mend their communities, to get past these fears, um, and to find ways to heal. And again, ultimately, that's what the 1650, 1640 shows us: is these things can't last for long. They burn out, they hurt, they harm, they don't bring that reunification we hope. So we need to find ways to be neighbours, and we need to find ways to accept each other. And
Hmm.
that's my soapbox. Yeah, be nice to people. I'm sorry to take a radical position there. Um,
I want to kind of bring up the third world as well because it's, and I believe, and I'm going to make an episode about this soon. I've been talking with someone who's a good friend of the podcast as well, and we're going to talk about the truth about colonialism and empire as well in the future. But I want to bring it up because in the third world, especially, and I believe this kind of draws from colonialism and the forcing of Christianity of in these colonies. There are people in the third world, and again, as I mentioned before, and as I mentioned, Ronald Hutton wrote about this, and I would absolutely recommend his book, The Witch, which you should check out, which also covers as well the medieval witch and as well as the modern witchcraft, which is quite sadly very much present in the third world, in countries like India, in African countries as well, where people are driven for almost no reason at all into utter poverty because they are taught to be a witch and because they have magic, to think people have magical powers. So it's quite sad how some of these modern witch hunts are quite a cause of colonial problems as well. I don't know if you agree with me here, but it seems, and again, I'm paraphrasing Ronald Hutton. If I remember, it's a while since I read it, so I'm not sure if I'm paraphrasing correctly. But it's from my understanding, it's partly because of colonialism, and because of the forced Christianization that so many African countries today still believe in witchcraft and have this witch hunt of innocent people, women and children, who are supposedly demonized or being accused of being a witch. So what are your thoughts on this?
I think we shouldn't doubt the kind of mimetic power of Christianity. It doesn't just spread at the edge of a sword. Its beliefs are really adaptable and interesting in how they engage with and
Hmm.
develop around existing cultures.
And
Mm.
again, before I want to continue, I want to say I'm not necessarily as a Christian. I'm just recognizing from this source that I read, and that I what I read about is what I and I believe there's some truth to this as well. So it's just not that I'm anti-Christian or
No,
anything.
no, no, no.
I But it's from what I understand from what Houghton has written about and etc. And it seemed to be some truth to this.
I think there's something about again, it's this going back to the Abrahamic faiths and the element of a dynamic between God and Satan or Shaitan, that it brings in an edge to maybe existing beliefs and existing conflicts that intensifies them radically. It offers obviously a chance for redemption and involvement of people, but at the same time, it can have that negative effect of identifying enemies and radicalizing people against them, shifting belief patterns. We saw it with that. Sometimes people like the Aztecs could be absorbed because their worldview of um, again a belief that comes through eating an enemy or eating power could be represented by the Last Supper that absorbed that in an interesting way. But obviously, with magical beliefs, it generally puts them in opposition to it. It's the power of the priest, the minister, versus the power of the enemy, and the way those overcome. And that creates a sort of tension there, which can be difficult to manage. I think one of the interesting talks today, like the one about by Alexandra Sonu, looking at the ways Romanian pagan beliefs were absorbed by Christianity, by the Orthodox, and found ways to make them acceptable. It's so interesting that it doesn't happen that often. We can exaggerate that, you know. But again, um, faith is so important, and with it, there's the fear of an enemy. That it means that paganisms, polytheisms that existed beforehand can be simplified down into, as symptoms of devils or demons, which again forces people into some quite difficult positions. Particularly, again, we went back to talk about cunning folk. That people like rainmakers, people like oracles, people healers, traditional healers, can either be absorbed or they can be destroyed and forced into enemies. And there's that tension which still exists within the third world. And again, it depends where and depends how. We think about South America, a lot of magical beliefs have been absorbed and linked to, particularly again, Catholicism is a lot more magical. But again, in a lot of Africa, where it tends to be more, I say, evangelical churches, which draws a lot of passion. And again, there is a role for miracles in them and for magical healing. But again, it's a lot more antithetical to absorbing some of these previous beliefs. But again, not my area of expertise. I don't want to oversimplify
Yeah, of course.
often
Yeah,
complex
no,
relationships.
and we're going to end quite soon, but I want to talk a little bit about, of course, because we had to kind of. I want to end a little bit on a light area, and I want to talk about witches in popular media.
Mm.
And what are your thoughts about, of course, famously Harry Potter? You have the and you have Sabrina the Teenage Witch and other series, Twilight, etc., etc. And what are your thoughts about media, the modern media? Because it's always seemed, and especially now, I believe we discussed this the last time as well. In Sabrina, there's of course the idea that they are associated with the devil, and again I bring up what we do in the shadows. There's I don't know if you've seen the series or the movie, but it's
Not up to
an
the point where they
episode
meet any
there
witches.
in a series where they're being kidnapped by witches. Yeah, and they had to steal the semen. For some, I don't remember why, but they had to steal the man's semen. But yeah, there's always this idea, especially in modern media, that witches are associated with the devil. And again, it's Sabrina the Teenage Witch. It's the Netflix adaptation, and I haven't seen the original, but in the Netflix adaptation especially deals with this. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, what's quite interesting is there's a couple of different ways of interpreting the witch in modern popular culture. So the worst witch, Harry Potter, where there's a private
Yeah.
school being educated and passing their owls. It's very much about the kind of learned magic that has generally been pretty acceptable in Europe, unless you're Dr. Faustus and you go and you sign a big contract with the devil. It's kind of almost like magic is on the edge of science. It's esoteric, but it's understandable. It follows rules. It follows patterns. Um, that's interesting. That's again the acceptable side. To some extent, different adaptations of Sabrina have been closer to that. The other element, which I think is more interesting in terms of we think of our Halloween horror films, is the element of the
Mm.
devil of the witch as female sexuality. So even quite early, there's this kind of lurid element to it. You think of the pamphlets that show naked witches meeting on heaths.
Yeah.
The idea that they make love to the devil, and the devil's a very disappointing lover. He's cold and wet,
Aw.
and he's not that good. No. He's the Prince of Lies. He's not very promising. So for those kind of things, there's a danger to that of both ways to explore female sexuality and the way it can seem threatening to men, about the way women can threaten their own secret societies. Um, you think of your Hammer horrors; they're perfect fodder for that. They're not they're dressed in something skimpy in the middle of the night. They're lighting a candle and going to cover themselves in blood. Um, there, and again, so that becomes linked to revivalism of paganism. So again, the claim of the Wicca religion that claims a connection to the pagan gods and worship of nature. Those sort of ideas become interlinked as a form of folk horror.
Mm.
But the interesting stuff, yeah, stuff like the most recent adaptation of Sabrina, The Witch by Robert Eggers. There are underlying themes there
What was
about
that old school that Brit? I think it's a British show where they. It's not Harry Potter, but it's kind of like it's kind of a Hogwarts pre-Hogwarts
the worst
school.
witch.
The worst with that's it. I remember that one going on telly a while ago when I was a child. That was a real fun one, wasn't it?
It is. It's very much. It's the model for a lot of Harry Potter that it's a private school, boarding school.
Yeah.
Um,
I
again,
mean
I
the
like it
effects
more to be
were
honest
kind
because
of
it's the
Doctor Who style, but it was still fun.
it was there's also lower stakes, and the main character was someone who's lovely person, just not very academic, and actually sort of struggles through with a good heart. And what really annoyed me, they did a more recent adaptation of it with
Have it got a reboot? I wasn't
yeah, they
aware of
have, but they've
this.
unfortunately made
Oh
her a bit more
really?
of a chosen one. Like,
Oh
yeah,
no, no.
no, Mildred Hubble is just a bit incompetent, but she's nice. I think
Oh.
that's why her character works. But yes, so but then yeah, element of that demonic danger, but also yeah, about the way we understand and challenge accepted orders, kind of element of rebellion. Um,
Mm.
Even I think the more recent Hocus Pocus has made the witches a bit more acceptable, a bit more.
What about the Witches of Waverly Place? What were your thoughts on that one?
That one I've not seen with the Wizards of. I think it's the
The
Wizards of Witch.
Disney Channel one?
No, I'm
Maybe
afraid
maybe it's before
I'm
your
too British. We
generation.
did we didn't get that kind of
Yeah,
thing. We didn't
yeah.
get no.
He did have Sky TV.
Um, we did get Sabrina, but we didn't get the Wizards of Waverly Place.
Mm.
Um, so yes, the Witch is interesting. That sort of mix of folk horror and others. And again, the Witchfinder remains an interesting figure.
Mm.
I remember there's a
What were your
comedy
thoughts?
sketch.
I'm sure you've seen Good Omens. What were your thoughts on witches there and the Witchfinder in general in Good Omens?
I think, yeah, I like the original book, and I think there's interesting. It's just the witch figure is just someone who the gift of prophecy with common sense. Um, again, it's very much that cliche of it that she's smarter than the people around her, so therefore they fear her.
Mm.
Not entirely accurate, but again, it's partly so the idea of the witch as a form of feminist empowerment. Strong women is what men fear. Like that claim that, we are the descendants of the witches they couldn't burn. I like that as, again, as a feminist figure. It's not accurate, but it's a nice way of reclaiming someone who has been done over by the patriarchy, even by other women trying to
Mm.
enforce conformity.
And something we haven't talked much about is wizards, and whether, of course, wizards and Merlin is one of the more famous. But they seem to
Hmm.
be more positive approach than witches
Yeah,
in
there's that line of
any
acceptability
part.
because they
Yeah.
tend to involve themselves in white magic. They're sort of researching it, astrology. And again, you spoke
And of
to
course,
Dr.
Gandalf is one of the more famous wizards of all.
Yeah, Gandalf, so almost a godlike figure. But again, it's educated, university educated, book educated, um, using magic in a sort of positive way, well educated. But again, still can fall to darkness, the temptation, the Faustus figure. Um, but again, it's the magic is neutral. It's about the character, the man. So your Saramans, or um,
Yeah.
which provides the contrast there, rather than sort of just inherently by being magical, you're evil like a witch.
Mm.
But again, men were accused of witchcraft, 1 in 10. But again, it's the line of acceptability. The kind of educated pursuits men carry out tend to be more acceptable. And again, Tabitha Stanmore, Cunning Folk, talks about this in a lot more depth in a really interesting way.
Mm. Well, I want to bring up one last thing, and that is alchemy. Was that kind of viewed as witchcraft in a way? The idea of finding gold and making gold, turning something into gold. Was that kind of viewed as witchcraft?
Well, this is the issue: is a lot of these things are on the edge of science and the edge of magic. So astrology, the practitioners would argue, generally they're not involving themselves in magic. They're not raising spirits. They're not doing. They're trying to understand the stars, and from that they try and predict the future. And alchemist claims, well, if I understand the base nature of the universe, the philosopher's stone, I can use that to change the base metal of lead into gold. So again, it's scientific, it's research based, but so the methodology being used, so the elements of how things connect, they fit with natural philosophy, but they don't fit with our modern science. So that kind of, again, you have some people like researchers like John Dee who are sort of on the edge of talking to angels. But the fear is, have they really
Maybe we
fallen to
have
the
Mother
devil?
Louise in Norway today who speaks to angels, so it's not that far off.
But again, is it really the angels you can talk to? Particularly post Reformation, the belief in spirits declines. Are they actually just
Or
secretly
space
devils?
wormholes in the DS9.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Well, are they gods or aliens or devils? Yeah.
Alien wormholes.
Hmm.
So sorry, wormholes, aliens. I think that's the
Wormhole aliens,
phrase.
yes.
Yeah.
So they
So
live in an alien wormhole, but they, yeah.
mm, it's interesting how kind of Merlin is more acceptable than say witches,
Well,
and
well, Merlin is
he's kind of the
interesting.
cool. It's interesting how wizards in
Well, again, this
general.
is this is why you should have asked
It's
Dr.
a kind of
Francis
bit
Youngwood of Dante.
hypocrisy in a way.
Yeah, but also I think Merlin's interesting because in his original conception, he is the Antichrist, but then he turns into the anti-Antichrist. That he's someone who turns away from being the devil's son to choose to be Christian, to be good. Yeah, there's a complexity there of identity, but it sees obviously men get a lot more autonomy to make choices compared to women who are seen to be easy to corrupt.
Hmm. So I think we're gonna round it up there. And again, for those, this live, but you can always watch this later on the YouTube channel if you are going if you did miss quite a lot of what we talked about today. But before you go, of course, do you have anything you want to promote? Where are you on social media? And do you have anything upcoming you want to share with us today? Of course, I thought last time you had some talks Do you have any upcoming talks in the UK where people might see you live, or if people want to reach out about more witches and witch stuff, where can people find you?
I'm on Twitter. Well, I'll keep calling it Twitter. Danny
Yeah,
Buck
you and me both.
UEA. Danny Buck UEA. Email danny.buck at live.co.uk. You can find me. Well, at the moment, I'm writing blog posts for the Militias of East Anglia, an East
Mm.
Anglian reenactment group. I've just finished all my talks. I gave one to the local WI. I gave one to the Norfolk Family History Society. All worthwhile and noble groups. I'm finished for the moment. But I'm now free to hire. That's the good news. So if you want someone to talk
Oh,
about witches, um,
do it, do it, do it.
I'm very reasonably priced. So yes, but yeah, no, I've got nothing particularly much coming up. I've got things I ought to be doing, but let's see if they come to fruition.
Don't we
I'll
all?
keep you updated.
Don't we all? Yeah, this has been a great pleasure to talk to you. And again, you're always welcome back to the podcast. And it's been always fun. About, I want to ask one last question. What do you think is the danger of using the term witch hunt as is popular in today's media? And is there? What do you think people should take away from this live stream if they are watching it again after this is finished, or what do you think people should get away from this, get from what we talked about today?
Mm. I think again, it's as we said a little bit earlier. It's about that trying to respect and understand our neighbours, and that again, the temptation can be there for a witch hunt to seek an enemy within, to seek a simplistic answer to our problems of we just need to purge ourselves of these people. We just need to deal with this, and then the whole thing's going to be perfect. And to accept that, yeah, the utopia isn't going to be that easy, and that we need to accept people are going to hold different views to us,
Mm,
and that yeah, we can't just think of them as enemies.
mm.
We've just
Thank you
got to
again
learn to
so much for
accept ourselves and accept others if we can.
that's a nice message right there, and I think we're gonna end it on that note. Our next live stream will already be on Tuesday. I think it's Tuesday, November 5th, because we will live stream the election of the United States of America, and we'll see how that goes. And fingers crossed, we will try to follow at least the three first hours of the election, because I'm living in Norway, so it's quite difficult for me because I like to sleep. I like to sleep as well. So I'm just a man. Like, I'm an innocent man, like anyone else. If you understood that reference, and I yeah, we will try to stream the three first hours of the election night. We'll talk a little bit about the historical elections in the United States. I'll try to have a few other guests on the live stream, and we will see how it goes. We will start a bit later than normal because we'll start 12 I think it's a.m. when it's strike midnight. So we try to start 12 a.m. at Central European time, or 11 a.m. p.m. Sorry, at UK time. And yeah, it's going to be fun. We're going to try to watch live on from BBC or whatever channel we choose to stream from. We're going to talk about historical elections from the first elections. We have some great guests coming on, including a very good friend of mine who studies this area, and we will talk about how, because this election is quite vital for not just for Americans but for world history. And I believe we are currently at the 1933 point, and we will explain this a lot more later in this live stream. So if you like this one, stay tuned for November 5th, and we will try to talk a little bit more about the election. So yeah, if you are interested in watching, we will try to do the best we can. And I think we're gonna round it up there. This has been about that age 12, and then again, you can find, as I always end with, and you can find us on social media on the Twitter/X. I'm still trolling Twitter, and then with that age 12. We are on Blue Sky as well, and then with that age 12, and Instagram, well, that age 12. We recently made a Halloween special on Dante's Inferno, so check that one out with the brilliant Francis Young. So check that one out. And I'll see you in the next live stream, November 5th. And take care. Thank you so much for joining us, Danny. It's been always a great pleasure to talk with you. And take care. Bye. There you go. What do you think?
Okay, good. Well, and